Why would experienced North Atlantic sailors leave arable land in Iceland and Norway to settle a coastline that even today tests modern logistics and endurance? The paradox is difficult to ignore. Greenland, a name that suggests fertility, has long been framed as a desperate gamble, a frozen exile chosen by men who had nowhere else to go. Yet archaeology confirms that they did go, that farms were built, churches were raised, cattle were wintered, and trade routes were sustained for centuries. The contradiction lingers. If Greenland was marginal even in a relatively mild medieval climate, why did the Vikings commit to it at all? The answer does not begin with romance or recklessness. It begins with pressure, perception, and a precise reading of environmental limits that modern hindsight too easily dismisses. A common assumption holds that the Vikings came to Greenland because they were banished, reckless, or driven by blind ambition. The saga of Eric the Red reinforces that image, portraying a man expelled from Iceland who turned westward in search of refuge. It is a compelling explanation because it reduces a complex migration to a single dramatic cause. Exile makes for a clean narrative. It suggests desperation. It implies that Greenland was chosen not because it made sense, but because there was nowhere else to go. Yet exile alone does not explain the organized movement that followed. Archaeological surveys at the eastern and western settlements reveal something far more deliberate. Farmsteads were carefully positioned along fjords with access to pasture and fresh water. Livestock were transported across open ocean in numbers that required coordination and planning. Land was divided and claimed within a recognizable Norse legal framework. These were not the scattered traces of fugitives improvising survival. They were calculated extensions of an agrarian system already refined under constraint in Iceland. By the late 10th century, the North Atlantic was entering what scholars now call the Medieval Climate Anomaly, a period of relatively milder temperatures that lengthened growing seasons and reduced sea ice. For farmers accustomed to thin Icelandic soils and short summers, parts of Greenland's sheltered fjords would not have appeared as a frozen wasteland. They would have appeared marginal, yet workable. Modern observers evaluate Greenland with centuries of climate data and satellite imagery. Medieval settlers judged it year by year, harvest by harvest. Within that narrower horizon, the land did not signal folly. It signaled opportunity bounded by limits they believed they understood. They did not sail blindly toward ice. They sailed toward a margin that fit the environmental and economic logic of their own time. Another widespread belief suggests that Greenland was chosen for its supposed abundance, as though the name itself functioned as a calculated exaggeration designed to entice settlers across a difficult sea. The argument is familiar. It assumes persuasion disguised hardship, and it implies that those who followed were misled by language rather than guided by evidence. Yet, environmental analysis offers a quieter and more disciplined explanation. Pollen records and sediment cores taken from southern Greenland reveal that during the early settlement period, there were measurable pockets of grassland capable of supporting grazing. These were not vast agricultural plains, and they did not need to be. The Norse economy did not depend primarily on grain cultivation. It was built upon livestock, especially cattle, sheep, and goats, animals capable of converting marginal grass into food, fiber, and stability. Within fjord systems shielded from the harshest Atlantic winds, summer pastures developed along protected slopes and valley floors. These microclimates created predictable seasonal grazing zones that could sustain herds long enough to produce hay for winter. The settlers reinforced this environmental reading through architecture. Turf longhouses, partially embedded in the ground, conserved heat and minimized exposure. This was not experimentation in an unknown land. It was a continuation of methods already refined in Iceland. They were not searching for forests rich with timber or endless fields ready for plow agriculture. They were searching for grazing corridors and seasonal cycles that aligned with a pastoral calendar shaped by generations of constraint. Greenland did not promise surplus. It presented a narrow operational margin, and the Norse, accustomed to living at the edge of viability, recognized that such margins could be sustained when carefully managed. Modern narratives often assume that isolation doomed the Greenland settlements from the beginning. The image is familiar and persuasive. Remote farms stand at the edge of a frozen coastline, cut off from Europe by shifting sea ice and violent Atlantic storms. From that vantage point, fragility seems inevitable, as though distance alone were enough to guarantee decline. Yet the archaeological record complicates that conclusion. Excavations at sites such as Brattahlid and Gardar reveal imported textiles woven with European techniques, iron tools forged beyond Greenland, and ecclesiastical artifacts that connect these settlements to the institutional life of medieval Christendom. These objects did not drift across the ocean by accident. They moved along established routes linking Greenland to Iceland and Norway. Most crucially, Greenland became a significant source of walrus ivory, a material highly valued in medieval Europe for religious carvings, luxury goods, and ecclesiastical objects. Recent isotopic analysis of ivory artifacts preserved in European collections has traced a substantial portion of them back to Greenlandic walrus populations. This evidence reframes the settlement not as a forgotten outpost, but as a specialized supplier within a broader North Atlantic economy. The trade was strategic rather than incidental. Greenland offered something scarce and desirable, and in return it received goods necessary for sustaining its agrarian society. The settlers were not marooned at the edge of the known world. They were participants in a commercial network calibrated to the environmental strengths of their landscape. Isolation remained a structural challenge. Sea routes were seasonal and unpredictable, yet specialization provided balance. Greenland endured not by escaping its remoteness, but by converting that remoteness into economic relevance within the rhythms of medieval exchange. It is often assumed that the Vikings failed in Greenland because they refused to adapt, clinging stubbornly to European farming traditions in a land that demanded transformation. The argument suggests cultural rigidity, as though pastoral identity blinded them to ecological reality. There is some truth in the observation that cattle remained central to their economy even as the climate gradually cooled. Yet, the archaeological record reveals a more nuanced pattern, one that speaks less of refusal and more of gradual recalibration. Zooarchaeological studies conducted at settlement sites show a measurable increase in marine resources over time. Seal bones become more prominent in later layers, particularly those associated with colder decades. Fish remains appear in greater quantities. The distribution of bones within middens reflects seasonal hunting strategies aligned with migratory patterns of marine mammals. These patterns suggest organized expeditions rather than desperate improvisation. Stable isotope analysis of human skeletal remains reinforces this shift. Over successive centuries, the chemical signatures preserved in bone collagen indicate rising levels of marine protein in the diet. This was not a sudden abandonment of farming. It was a layered adjustment that integrated sea-based resources into an existing pastoral framework. The Norse did not ignore the ocean surrounding them. They engaged with it deliberately, while maintaining the social and legal structures that revolved around land ownership and livestock. Adaptation in Greenland was measured and conservative. It unfolded incrementally, reflecting a society balancing environmental necessity with cultural continuity. Another assumption portrays Greenland as a land perpetually locked in ice, a frozen expanse that could never have sustained agrarian life. From that perspective, the Norse appear to have misjudged the climate entirely, as though they mistook a polar wilderness for workable farmland. It is a powerful image, but it does not align with the paleoclimatic evidence now available. Tree ring data from surrounding North Atlantic regions and ice core analyses drawn from Greenland's interior suggest that the early centuries of Norse settlement coincided with relatively favorable conditions. During what scholars identify as the Medieval Climate Anomaly, temperatures in parts of the North Atlantic were modestly higher than in later centuries. Growing seasons were slightly extended. Sea ice along key sailing routes was less persistent. These changes were subtle by modern standards, yet for a livestock-based economy, even small climatic shifts could determine whether hay production met the threshold required for overwintering cattle. Hay was not a luxury. It was the difference between herd survival and herd loss. The early settlers appear to have operated within a climatic margin that made such production feasible. Their farms were positioned in fjords where microclimates offered some shelter from prevailing winds. The system was demanding, but it was viable. The later onset of the Little Ice Age altered that balance. Winters lengthened, sea ice expanded. Trade routes became less predictable. Agricultural yields tightened. What had once been a narrow but workable window gradually constricted. The Norse decision to settle Greenland was not a miscalculation in a static and hostile climate. It was a commitment made during a period of relative opportunity. Their world did not shatter in a single season. It narrowed slowly, as environmental variables shifted beyond the range they had learned to manage. It is tempting to frame the arrival of the Norse in Greenland as an act of conquest over a barren and empty land. The image fits neatly into older narratives of exploration, where expansion is equated with possession and unfamiliar terrain is described as vacant simply because it was unfamiliar to Europeans. Yet Greenland was not empty. Long before and during periods of Norse settlement, indigenous peoples associated with what archaeologists identify as the Thule culture inhabited Arctic regions and moved through parts of Greenland. Their presence was dynamic and adaptive, shaped by seasonal mobility rather than fixed farmsteads. The material evidence of interaction between Norse settlers and Inuit groups remains limited, but it is significant. Artifacts of Norse origin have been recovered in Inuit contexts, and items reflecting Arctic hunting technologies appear within Norse sites. These traces suggest contact, whether through exchange, observation, or occasional tension. What the archaeological record does not strongly support is a pattern of sustained, large-scale conflict. Instead, we see parallel systems operating within the same ecological frame. The Norse and the Inuit approached Greenland with fundamentally different strategies. Inuit societies relied heavily on marine mammals. Sophisticated harpoon technology, skin boats, and mobility adapted to shifting sea ice. Their seasonal movements followed the rhythms of animal migration and ice formation. The Norse, by contrast, structured their society around stationary farms, livestock ownership, and legal institutions tied to land. The contrast does not imply superiority on either side. It reflects divergent adaptations to the same environmental constraints. Greenland became a landscape where strategy, rather than bravery alone, determined sustainability. Survival there was not a measure of conquest. It was a measure of how precisely a culture aligned its tools, diet, and mobility with the realities of ice, wind, and sea. A persistent belief holds that the Greenland settlements vanished abruptly, swept away by catastrophe or violent conflict. The imagination fills the silence with drama. It pictures raids, starvation, or a final desperate stand against an unforgiving climate. Yet the archaeological record does not support a narrative of sudden annihilation. There is no widespread evidence of massacre, no layers of ash suggesting coordinated destruction, no mass graves marking a single catastrophic event. Instead, we see something quieter. Farmsteads appear to have been abandoned gradually. Buildings deteriorated over time rather than being burned. Livestock numbers declined, reflected in changing bone assemblages. The rhythm of daily life seems to have thinned before it ceased. At the same time, broader economic shifts altered Greenland's position within the North Atlantic trade network. European demand for walrus ivory weakened as elephant ivory became more accessible through expanding trade routes to Africa. A commodity that had once justified difficult voyages lost some of its value. Trade ships arrived less frequently. Imported goods became scarcer. Written references to Greenland in Icelandic and Norwegian sources grow sparse, then fall silent. The pattern resembles attrition rather than disaster. Families may have chosen to return to Iceland, others may have integrated into different communities. The end was likely uneven and extended across decades. When ecological and economic margins narrow, communities do not always collapse dramatically. They contract. Greenland was not the stage for a final spectacle. It was the setting for a slow recalibration in which leaving, over time, became more rational than remaining. Modern observers sometimes judge the Greenland venture as a failure, a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding environmental reality. The story is often framed as overreach followed by decline, as though the outcome alone defines the wisdom of the attempt. Yet this interpretation depends heavily on hindsight. It measures success by permanence and overlooks the context in which decisions were made. For nearly 5 centuries, Norse communities sustained themselves along Greenland's fjords. That span is longer than the lifespan of many medieval settlements across Europe. Within that time, they built churches of stone and turf, maintained legal assemblies that mirrored Icelandic tradition, negotiated disputes, arranged marriages, raised children, and marked their dead in consecrated ground. These were not transient camps. They were functioning societies embedded in ritual, law, and belief. Life in Greenland required constant negotiation with climate, soil, and sea. Each summer demanded sufficient hay for winter survival. Each sailing season required calculation of risk and reward. The endurance of these communities was not accidental. It reflected accumulated knowledge and disciplined management of fragile margins. They did not conquer Greenland in any imperial sense. They inhabited it, generation after generation, within limits they believed sustainable. When conditions shifted beyond the capacity of their social and economic framework, the decision to leave may have reflected the same pragmatic reasoning that once drew them there. Knowing when to withdraw can be as adaptive as knowing when to advance. In that light, Greenland becomes less a story of failure and more a study in measured engagement with a changing world. So, why did the Vikings come to Greenland? Not because they misunderstood the land, and not because they believed themselves invincible, but because within the climate and economic realities of their century, Greenland fit within a narrow but workable equation. They recognized opportunity in gradients that modern eyes see only as extremes. They built within limits, traded within networks, and adjusted as conditions evolved. When those limits tightened beyond sustainability, they receded without spectacle. History often celebrates expansion and conquest, yet it rarely pauses over the quieter movements of settlement and retreat. The story of Greenland is not one of glory or ruin. It is a reminder that human communities survive by reading the boundaries of their environment with care and by accepting that those boundaries shift. The Norse farmers who once stood in Greenland's fjords were neither reckless adventurers nor tragic fools. They were people making measured decisions in a changing world, guided by the knowledge available to them and by the needs of their families. If this story resonates with something in your own family's past, perhaps a migration across a continent, a homestead carved from difficult ground, or a decision to leave when circumstances changed, that memory carries the same quiet logic. History endures not because it is triumphant, but because it is lived within limits. And sometimes, understanding why people arrived is inseparable from understanding why, one day, they chose to depart.